5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Puck short.
Hello everybody and welcome to this week's episode of the One Puck Short podcast. My guest this week is a writer for NHL.com and the managing editor of InGoal magazine. Please welcome Mr. Kevin Woodley back to the show. Hi Kevin.
How are you, Rob?
I'm very well, thanks. Thanks for joining me again tonight. We spoke earlier in the season. Obviously we're deep into the playoffs now. The conference semi-finals kick off tonight. One of the biggest stories this round, Jonas Hiller up against his former team and Frederick Anderson in net for the Ducks. As a heck of a battle, I think we've got there the old veteran versus the young pretender. Hiller's got a point to prove in Anaheim, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're probably going to hear a lot about who has the advantage, Hiller knowing the shooters or the shooters knowing Hiller. And, it's interesting. Getzlaf said this morning that it really doesn't matter what you know of a goalie. You learn everything you need to know going into a series in a 5 to 10 minute video presentation. I found that interesting in part because I've done some of those breakdowns on goalies and you never want to hear them diminished in one sentence as a 5 to 10 minute video presentation because they literally take days to put together. But also shows that, some of the scouting reports that we're doing at InGoal magazine and NHL.com on these goalies, really are exactly what the goalie coaches are doing to prepare their shooters for what they're about to see and what kind of tactics and trends and habits you might be able to exploit in specific situations on a guy. And for Hiller, hey, listen, the easy one is, hey, shoot high, right? That's a no-brainer against most butterfly goaltenders. And let's face it, Hiller plays more from his knees than most guys, and he makes no apologies for it.
Yeah.
But it's more what situations. The reality is with Jonas Hiller, in tight end scrambles, you may be better off to try and beat him along the ice than up top. Unless you can, he's so good side to side on his knees and he closes that space off vertically so well that it's easier said than done unless you can move the puck laterally on him before raising it. But in the scramble, in tight, with a narrow butterfly, like he has, a guy who closes the 5-hole with his knees instead of with his pads, he just doesn't have a real wide flare down there. He gives up, in those situations, the majority of his goals are through the legs, 5-hole or under the pads. So those are the types of trends that you look for. They're not always the where to shoot on clean looks trends because the reality is you don't get many of those clean looks in the playoffs. If you are getting them in the playoffs, chances are the team giving them up isn't going to be around for very long, so you won't have to worry about it. And so it's funny that we talk about trends on goaltenders and teams knowing former teammates in net, and I just don't think most NHL practices where they're coming down the wing and winding up and got all kinds of time and space to pick a spot are really all that relevant to NHL playoff games. You're looking more for, as a goalie coach, trying to pick up trends, jam plays. Does he use VH in this situation, reverse VH in that situation? Does he leave himself exposed on either one? So if you're coming to a dead angle off the wing, off a rush, and he goes into VH, is there exposure there short side? And in Hiller's case, absolutely not. He's so good at getting up and tight. The Canucks tried to pick him short side, coming off the glove in a VH situation off the rush so many times, and he just swallowed it up. In that situation, a good pre-scout, I think, would tell you it's better to throw it off the far pad and hope it ends up in the slot. Now, coming from below the goal line, Hiller has changed his game a little bit in Calgary. He's added some more reverse VH. He's gotten more consistent with how he manages his post play. And so how you attack him depends on how you think you can exploit some of those tactics. He's not as aggressive as he was in Anaheim. For all the talk about on his knees, he would come out and challenge there. He plays, especially against end zone opportunities, he plays a little bit deeper in Calgary. Because they're collapsing shot block mentality, he feels he needs that extra time to be able to react to late deflections off all the bodies that are typically piled up in front of him. And so it's been a real nice fit there for him, both with the goalie coach Jordan Sigalet, who who to me is one of the better guys in terms of being able to work with different styles rather than dictate his style to different goalies. And with Hiller, there's just a real good fit between a goaltender that is patient on his skates, despite staying on his knees a lot. That sort of knock-kneed stance of his, it almost looks like he's down before he is. He holds his edges really well in that stance and shifts laterally into plays. And so that's a really good fit with a team that likes to block a lot of shots. I mean, I'm surprised that Kari Ramo has any success there because he plays so far outside the blue ice.
Yeah.
When there are deflections, you'd expect him to be stranded. Yet that same collapsing mentality also means that they do a pretty good job of protecting the back door for him. So, different styles of goaltenders, and it will be interesting. Should the Ducks get to Hiller? Should we see Kari Ramo? I believe you really have to adjust how you attack him because you are talking about an entirely different style of goaltender and a guy who doesn't just play the position differently. Where he plays the position is completely different from Jonas Hiller. So if the Ducks chase Hiller, they got to adjust how they attack on the number 2 option in Calgary. And I know the Flames have faith in both, and they won't hesitate to go that route if things start to go against them in the series.
Yeah, it's interesting talking about the difference in styles because, as you said, Anaheim can set up one way for Hiller, and if it works, they're facing a completely different scenario with Kari Ramo. And the Flames can quite easily switch back again. And you can keep the Ducks on their toes almost in a slightly bizarre way just by flipping these guys, maybe from game to game or depending on the situation, even within games if things aren't working.
Yeah, no, and that's a good point. I'm not sure they do it game to game, but it would almost be tempting to see them try. I mean, that scouting report that Getzlaf talked about, that 5 to 10 minute video, it's not the same for both guys. Now, I'd like to think because of the propensity to go back and forth that the Ducks probably have a scouting report ready on both guys. Like I said, you don't churn these out in 10 minutes. It's a lot of work, even at the NHL level where every goal and touch and puck handle is clipped for you by a video guy. These things don't happen in a couple hours. And so it would be interesting to see whether they would be prepared to make an adjustment that quickly. I mean, we saw it, ironically, in the Calgary series. When the Canucks switched from Eddie Lack to Ryan Miller, Calgary started to switch how they attack to try and, I think the thought was that Ryan Miller plays further out in his crease and we have to sort of pass it around him and make him move laterally, especially with the knee injury. And it didn't work for the first, the relief appearance in the first game he played because the knee injury sort of kind of quieted Ryan's game. He actually played more of a contained, controlled game. I think because maybe he didn't feel he had the lateral mobility, and ironically, that's how the Canucks would like him to play all the time. But then in Game 6, facing elimination, it's like the golfer coming down the back nine, making a swing change. He's changed how he swings, but all of a sudden he's in contention, and the pressure ratchets up, and he goes back to the old swing. Ryan Miller went back to his old swing in Game 6. He got caught outside the crease all night. And if it wasn't rebounds, it was passes. They just basically moved the puck around him, and he wasn't able to get there laterally, not just because of the knee injury, but because he exposed himself laterally by playing more aggressively than he had in his first 2 appearances.
Yeah. At the other end of the ice, Frederik Andersen looks set to go for the Ducks. When we spoke early in the season, it was still unclear how the Ducks goaltending would pan out. Obviously, they had John Gibson, Jason LaBarbera was there, a very experienced number 2. Later in the season, Ilya Bryzgalov came in, but Frederik Andersen's had a pretty good year for the Ducks. He seized the number 1 job. He had some trouble with injuries last year, had a couple of bad games as well, but he's looked the part this year.
Yeah, guy did his work in the offseason. I mean, kind of like Eddie Lack here in Vancouver. Learn from the injuries. I mean, injuries are going to happen at any point, but there are times when you have to recognize that maybe you weren't quite there physically, and both of them did that. And so you've seen a healthy season from Freddie Andersen. Hey, listen, I just believe that Freddie Andersen is a real good goalie, and he's only going to get better because of that work ethic and that desire to be the best, not just really good. I also thought that there was some talk before Gibson got hurt late in the season that, which one was going to start. I liked Andersen in large part because they hardly played down the stretch. I think they had 2 games in the final 2 weeks, or Andersen had 2 games in the final 2 weeks, and Gibson had 1. Their schedule was just so light. But I don't mind that for Freddie Andersen because he's a really technically sound, solid guy. He doesn't rely overly on sort of rhythm and timing. He's got some flow in his game. He's got a little backwards flow. There are times it even costs him. When I broke down all the goals on him this year, there was certainly a trend. The amount of clean shots he gave up, clean goals, off the rush, clean looks, surprised me. But then when you broke it down, it was a lot of far side goals where that little bit of backwards flow he had and a little bit of lateral shuffles. He, say he's moving to his left and he get caught pushing off that right skate a little bit as the shot was released to his right. Now, it's hard to react back in that direction when your weight's on that right skate, for example. So there's a little, I wonder if he'd be better without that extra movement. He's certainly a big enough goaltender at 6'3" that he doesn't need to be outside the blue, and there are times he will challenge that far in end zone play as well and get his heels outside top of the crease. I know they feel in Anaheim with Dwayne Rolson, the goalie coach, that he's got the lateral foot speed, the work he did physically on his legs and core this summer. He's got the power to recover that space. But when I break down the goals, there are times, frankly, that he just doesn't. Either he gets beat with one-timers on the far side after lateral passes. Hey, tough plays, no doubt, but you like to see yourself at least get to position to give yourself a chance. And there are times he doesn't. There are other times where the power and explosion of his pushes leaves him vulnerable. He's still moving as the shot's coming, and he can get caught against the grain and opened up in 5-hole or in rebound situations. So as good as he is, I wonder if he might even be better if he played a little more contained. But, he likes to have a little, like Carey Price in Montreal. He still likes to have a little bit of movement in his game. And, like I said, it costs him at times, but for the most part, I just think he's a really good goalie. And as long as Bruce Boudreau doesn't start playing musical goaltenders and undermining his guys, and let's be honest, this is part of it for Jonas Hiller. You want to talk about motivation. It's not just, a lot of people say, Hiller didn't play well, that's why he lost the job. And yeah, to an extent, that's part of it. But you talk to guys in that room, and there are, circumstances that lead up to that. During the streak, when things start to get off the rails for a goaltender, how a coach handles that situation, not just in terms of the workload or the rotation or the trust he shows, but in terms of the way he verbally handles it in the locker room. And my understanding is that there's a reason Boudreau's chewed up goaltenders in the playoffs, and that's because of how he handles them and at times undermines them in front of his team in that locker room. And this comes from guys who have been in rooms where he's coached before. So I'm not pulling this out of the nether regions here. This is what I've been told from other people in those rooms. And so for Jonas Hiller, he really likes what's going on in Calgary. He told me he likes that when a shot's coming, he knows everybody on his team is trying to block it, whereas in Anaheim, it would be one defenseman might try and the other might not. Like, he just really didn't know. And again, to me, that's a function of team play. And I think he'd like to show that it wasn't all on him in Anaheim, that, hey, the way that team defended in the playoffs and down the stretch last year with 3 real young guys on the back end, and the way his coach kind of handled the situation all played a role in it.
Yeah. You talked about a little bit of flow in Anderson's game. I'll use that as a segue to move over to the East and talk about Braden Holtby, who is another guy who likes to play with a little bit of rhythm. We talked about it in the InGoal first round previews that we did, how he likes to have that rhythm, he likes to have that flow. He's got it back, I think, working with Mitch Korn this year. But he's up against Henrik Lundqvist, who is one of the at least top 3, if not top 2 goalies in the league. This is a really intriguing battle, I think, because Holtby likes to play with that rhythm, and Lundqvist is just old dependable, effectively.
Yeah, it's funny. I read all the stories too, and I've talked to Mitch throughout the season about some of the changes they've made, and reading some of the sort of stories about how Holtby's changed his game. I mean, yes, last year under Adam Oates, they tried to get him to play a real passive, stationary game, and that didn't work for him. He's got to have a little bit of movement. But he is not, as I wrote for my breakdown just this morning, he's not painting wildly outside of the lines like some 3-year-old that you give a box of crayons to. I mean, there's a fair bit of control and containment. As a matter of fact, he's not Peter Mrazek level aggressive, to be honest with you. If you want to,
not many people are.
No, and he's not that far out there. So he paints around the edges. Heels out is a term I like to use, and that describes Braden's game. I think off the rush and probably a little more even toes to the edge or maybe heels on the edge of the crease on end zone when he's at his most aggressive. So he doesn't chase a lot. Yet, for all that said, it was interesting to note there was a lot of exposure, high glove. Again, we expect shots to go in, high blocker, high glove. That's the reality of butterfly goaltending. But literally 54 goals mid to high glove range, which was more than a third of what he gave up this season. And a lot of that was because the extra movement on rushes seemed to leave him caught. Sometimes the backwards flow didn't include squaring up. So as a play would come down the left wing to his right and he would back in, he wasn't rotating with that rush. He was backing straight up. So he wouldn't be squaring around that left shoulder to the shooter, and he'd get exposed on the glove side because he wasn't square. You know how it is as a goaltender. As soon as you lose that squareness and you're not perfectly, you may have your angle, but you're not turned and square into it. Pucks go through you or pucks sneak by you. And as athletic as Braden is, I'll be honest, some of this surprised me doing the video work. I spent a lot of time in the last 24 hours going over it just to be sure. As athletic and explosive as his movements are, he can get passive with his hands. And there is a tendency there to drop that glove side hand to his side and then try and shoulder shrug or catch pucks high with his elbows. And I think that also played a role in his exposure on that. Hey, also part of it's the looks they give up as well. And if a shooter's got time and space, he's going to get you in that spot. But it was really interesting to compare that to Lundqvist, who, he's more exposed off his hips on the glove side. You shoot high glove on Lundqvist, he'll pick those cherries all day. You go in off his hips when he goes into that half butterfly and kind of opens up that side of his body, and that's where you're more likely to have success. So, there are interesting trends in how they play, not just where they play on the ice, one more aggressive and one more passive, but even the way they move and use their gloves and how shooters should target different spaces on the net based on that for Lundqvist versus Braden Holtby.
I remember we talked about Holtby specifically earlier in the year because obviously he was working with Mitch Korn. He's played 73 games this year. Lundqvist had, albeit an injury-forced break. Now, in the past, it's been Lundqvist who's carried a heavy workload. Do you think that time off, again, it may be due to injury, but that extra little bit of rest he's had this year, is that going to be a factor as the playoffs progress? Because a lot of people think the Rangers are going to go almost as far as Henrik Lundqvist might be able to carry them.
You know what? I honestly think it could be a factor, and not that I'm smart enough to know or figure that out myself or have anything I could relate to, but mostly because I trust Steven Valiquette, who's doing some work with MSG Networks and is around that situation and played with Henrik and knows Henrik. And he just feels like because it was an upper body injury and because of the nature of it, that there was an ability to rest, recover, but also just still do the work needed to stay strong down low. I mean, he was on the ice even before he was approved to come back. He was on the ice working with Ben Hilaire, making sure he had all those movements crisp and sharp. And he really felt like if there was enough time to kind of get his sort of timing back and feel some pucks in games late in the season, that this could be the best you see of Henrik Lundqvist in these playoffs. I mean, he certainly doesn't, not that anybody needs motivation, at this time of year, but I mean, when you talk to Henrik, I mean, it burns with this guy. Like, it burns with this guy. He's like Luongo, right? He wants to be the best so much. And I just think that he recognizes the opportunity he has and the ability to lock in and not feel any fatigue. I absolutely think that could be a factor, not just in this series against the guy who's been a real workhorse this year, but as we get further into the playoffs and potentially into a Stanley Cup final. There were signs of fatigue in Henrik's game in the Stanley Cup final last year. There were goals, for as much as people thought the Kings would dominate that series, I think it could have been a lot closer if Lundqvist doesn't give up some goals that, frankly, he normally doesn't. And I wouldn't expect him to second time around if he gets there this year.
Flipping ahead to tomorrow, Montreal and Tampa were the top two in the Atlantic this year. I think most people would probably say Tampa has the edge at forward and on the blue line, but between the pipes, Carey Price has been lights out for most of the year. Ben Bishop came up big in Game 7 against the Red Wings, but are they going to be able to find a way to solve Carey Price? Because the Habs will still score, I think. And as we said, Bishop struggled slightly. You'd favour Tampa in theory, but I've got to say I fancy Montreal to come through this series.
Yeah, it's a tough one. I'd actually go the other way. just because I think Tampa sort of creates more. They just create so many more good opportunities against Carey. At the end of the day, it's a function of what you give up sometimes, and I think Tampa's a team that sort of had Montreal's number here. So that's where my money is. Not that I'm very, my hockey poolies would tell you I'm not very good at that anyway. So don't go running out to the betting office on that one. But I just think, I think Bishop got a lot of focus for not having a great start to the playoffs, and we can't forget that it is his first taste of this. But I didn't think he was actually that bad. There were a couple of gaffes that made it look worse than I think it was, and as long as he's not chasing and he's not opening up holes in that massive frame, he's okay. And so it's more a question of, can Montreal, who quite frankly, Andrew Hammond was a great story, but Ottawa lost arguably 2 games because of his goaltending. You break down the chances, it just wasn't good enough. And you saw what happened when Anderson went in there. And yes, Anderson's played very well against Montreal in the past. Ben Bishop's not the same goalie as Craig Anderson style-wise or anything, but I think he's capable of shutting down what little offense Montreal has right now. And I just think there's going to be it's going to be a big ask for Carey to pardon the pun, but carry the load as heavily as he may be asked to in this series. And the other thing is, Carey still has a lot of extra movement and aggression in his game at times. There have been times this year, and there were times in that first round where he chased. And again, his movement is so good, and his recovery is so good that he gets away with it more often than not. But if Tampa creates those kind of looks and forces that kind of lateral movement, he gets caught too far to one side or the other and has to make up for it. I like their chances of finishing. Nothing against him. Carey Price is the best goalie in the world. All the usual caveats. He's like a human how-to goal and all those things. But there still is a tendency. He still likes movement in his game, and there's still times where it can catch him. And I'm not saying it's going to happen, but the first round wasn't perfect for him. And there are ways. I just don't know if Montreal as a team is good enough to overcome their deficiencies, even with Carey Price in goal, as spectacular as he's been.
Yeah. The final semi-final matchup, Chicago against Minnesota. Minnesota topped the Blues, who I thought would win the Stanley Cup this year, and a few other people did. Devin Dubnyk definitely won the battle against Jake Allen. Corey Crawford goes back in the net for the Blackhawks. Again, this is kind of an intriguing battle, given what happened with Crawford in the first round and the season Devin Dubnyk's had. But I thought the Blackhawks did a great job scouting Pekka Rinne, exposing that blocker side, which I know the InGoal team talked about a few times between ourselves. And this is one of the biggest tests Dubnyk's going to have had this year, because the Hawks are going to study him so closely heading into this matchup.
Yeah, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Jimmy Waite, brother, Steph Waite, now in Montreal, the goalie coach, to me in Chicago, and I got a close-up look at it in some of the series that the Blackhawks played against the Canucks. Yeah. Steph broke down the opposing goaltender exceptionally well, adjusted on the fly when he saw changes, and would be actually out there in practice. I remember one practice where he actually had pylons set up on the ice, not for his goaltenders, but for the shooters, to funnel them into areas where he thought they needed to be and change their habits against Roberto Luongo after he had changed his playing style. He used to be more aggressive, and the Hawks used to pass the puck around him. Well, when he got deeper, they kept trying to pass the puck around him, and he was getting there and making these great saves. And Steph finally, in practice, pulled out these pylons and forced his shooters to cut in the middle of the ice where, hey, open looks from the middle and a goalie who's closer to the goal line, that's where you expose them. So clearly Jimmy, it seems like, has gone to the same school in terms of breaking down opposing goalies. And I did think they did a good job against Pekka Rinne, who, as spectacular athletically as he is, does play a style of goal that forces him to rely on that athleticism. Yeah. Arguably at times more than he might need to, but he's so damn good at it. I have a tough time supporting any of those arguments. Here's the thing about Dubnyk. He plays to me, the easiest goalies to break down are the ones that play to extremes. either aggressively or passively. And the funny thing is, Henrik Lundqvist is the most passive at times, and clearly nobody's solved that equation. Although on a quick little sidebar note on Lundqvist, I was shocked at the amount of times he got to the top of his crease and a couple of times a foot beyond it, challenging point shots against the Pittsburgh Penguins.
Yeah.
And they scored 5 of their 8 goals on rebounds after he got caught moving around way up high in his crease. So that's an interesting trend to look for in that Rangers series. Yeah. But back to Dubnyk, I just don't think he plays to the same extremes, and I think it's going to be a little harder to exploit. And as long as he continues to do what he's been doing in terms of the way he moves and tracks the puck and doesn't start reaching and opening up holes, he keeps everything tight and contained, he'll be okay. On top of that, he needs the Minnesota. This is the other thing about Dubnyk.
Yeah.
And this is no slight. The Minnesota Wild should be a dream team to play goal behind. There are nights I'm pretty sure I could do it, and that's saying something. They're a very good defensive team. So that those two things have to go hand in hand. I mean, if they start opening up and giving up chances that force him to open up, they could be in trouble. But I love the way he's playing right now. And quite frankly, I thought the difference in that series last year between these two teams was goaltending. And it's a little bit ironic that the shoe seems to be on the other foot, whereas Brizgalov just frankly wasn't good enough once the Hawks started to get better looks.
Yeah.
This year we go in and it's Crawford who's got the question marks and is a guy who seems to be riding highs and lows right now, and Dubnyk is just steady Eddie. So I actually kind of, if I was looking for what I think most people would consider a long shot bet to make, mine would be on the Minnesota Wild to get past this round based on goaltending. That's the way I go. And who thought we would have been saying that this time last year with Devin Dubnyk?
Well, precisely. And he had a terrible year last year, finished the season in the AHL with Hamilton, but he's been incredible, really, for most of this year in the backup role with Arizona behind Mike Smith. He had his share of struggles, and then obviously in Minnesota, he turned their season around. As I mentioned, he out-battled Jake Allen, and I'd kind of like to pull things maybe to some of the off-season moves we might see in the goaltending market, because there was a suggestion that Brian Elliott might be looking to move on. Obviously, Jake Allen didn't have the best series against the Wild, particularly in that elimination game. He struggled and was pulled. Where did the Blues go here? Because I remember earlier in the season when Marty Brodeur came in, people were questioning what it meant for Elliott and Allen. I know Elliott was hurt at the time. But it seems strange to me because, as I said, Elliott was hurt. So St. Louis needed a goalie. They brought a guy in. If Jake Allen was that threatened by him, it makes me wonder about his temperament. Obviously, this is, as we said with Ben Bishop, this is Allen's first taste of NHL playoff action, but it's become a big question mark for the Blues. Again, this is a great team, kind of like the Wild. You would think it was a dream to play on the Blues, but they seem to have an issue back there right now.
Yeah, there's cracks in the armor in terms of how they defend. There are cracks in the Hitchcock coaching armor in terms of the buy-in on that team, and you see it show up at times in games. So they're not quite as easy peasy as they used to be to play behind, but certainly yes. Yeah. I mean, traditionally, Ken Hitchcock teams, that's the way it is. Listen, this is a tough one. Jake Allen, I believe, is the future there. I just don't know.
That's the way a lot of people see it.
What the need was to go to him now. They continuously show that they don't have faith in Brian Elliott as the guy. They had just finished telling the world Brian Elliott was going to be the guy. He stubbed his toe for 2 regular season games. Allen got in a roll, and they changed their mind. I mean, you undermine Elliott when you bring in Miller last year, who create all these question marks. When you bring in Brodeur this year, and to me, those questions were not about Jake Allen. They were about Brian Elliott. It's pretty clear the organization doesn't have clear faith in him. Yeah. And if there was ever a time to give him a go, it would have been this year. Because I think that Allen showed you that he wasn't quite ready for that. Yeah. And again, I still think he's the future. I really believe in this kid as the future there. But it just made and Brian Elliott is a perfect foil, because if you need someone to play more games, like if you don't want to hand the reins blindly over to Allen, be a workhorse, and I don't think he's ready to be a workhorse either. He still needs time between starts to tinker and work on his game. Elliott's a perfect spot for that. So,
yeah, for sure.
So why undermine? And the other thing about Elliott is, I think he's changed his game so much since he came out of college. He's in a good place technically. I like the way he plays in so many regards. The only questions were sort of between the ears, and some of the pregame rituals and routines over the past few years, the juggling and stuff like that. There were questions about whether were they superstitions or habits? If they didn't go well, did it affect the way he played? And I'd heard that. I don't really know if it's true or not, but I'd heard those questions about him, and I'd also heard he'd gotten better with it. So for a guy, if this is a guy that's still trying to work through things between the ears, they sure didn't do a very good job as an organization of supporting that effort. It just, to me, this was the year you needed to ride Brian Elliott. And because you didn't, you've created all these question marks. And Elliott can say all he wants that he's willing to stay there, and good for him. I don't think he'd be a bad teammate knowing, going in there and being the support guy to Jake Allen. But when you don't have a chance, when you've never really gotten that chance, I got to think that there's just something that sort of bubbles below the surface that's just probably not healthy in the long run. From all the talk about the St. Louis room, there may be a lot of that going around in terms of the coach and the players.
Yeah, it's a strange one because Elliott's been pretty dependable for the Blues. He broke the franchise record for shutouts this season. His highest highs probably aren't as high as Jake Allen's, but then his lows probably aren't either. He's a much more evened out goalie. He's generally been pretty dependable for St. Louis, and he's
had some pretty good highs too. This is what I don't get. I think there are other teams that would give him that shot, and for whatever reason, not all of them, but there are some, and for whatever reason, the Blues keep hanging on to him, yet aren't willing to go all the way with him, and it just couldn't be more clear they don't have that faith. They've proved it 3 years in a row now, so it's a mystery to me too, and frankly, they only have themselves to blame.
So we've just talked about Elliott maybe moving on. So he enters the goalie market as well. Antti Niemi, his future in San Jose is up in the air. Devin Dubnyk, of course, is a free agent. To me, this is one of the most interesting off-seasons goalie-wise for some time. You've got Matt O'Connor, the Boston University goalie. Apparently he's narrowed his shortlist down to 4, the Senators, Rangers, Oilers and the Canucks. The Canucks also added John Gillies from Providence. So there's a bit of movement going on. Cam Ward and Anton Khudobin are continually linked with movement. It's quite an interesting summer ahead. The Oilers are probably the most notable team who are going to be looking for a goaltender for, I think, obvious reasons. But there's some other teams in play too.
Yeah, no, Gillies is Calgary. Just to correct
Calgary, sorry. Yeah.
Matt O'Connor, I like what I'm hearing from his agent, that he doesn't expect to be in the NHL, that he knows he needs some development time in the American Hockey League. And there's a little part of me that says, yeah, no kidding. But it's, amid all the hype around him, it's nice to know that he recognizes that too. NCAA to NHL to pro hockey in general is not a one-step adjustment.
Yeah.
And you watch these guys, and they play outside the blue paint in the NCAA. He plays outside the blue paint at 6'5".
Yeah, watched the Frozen Four. I noticed that.
Yeah, you cannot play that way in pro hockey. Not at 6'5". You can't play that way at 5'6" in pro hockey. I mean, you can't. You just can't. If you can, okay, I shouldn't say that. Pekka Rinne can. But I'm not convinced that Matt O'Connor's Pekka Rinne. So there is typically a 2-year learning curve from NCAA to pro. And I, so talking to some people, I would argue it's probably closer to 3. So the idea that Matt O'Connor is somebody's future next year is absurd to me. And I really hope that he's smart enough to and frankly, it sounds like it. That him and his management team are smart enough to recognize that any team saying, sign with us and you'll play right away, that's probably not a good idea. It probably means they haven't got a clue about development plans. I know that's not what the Vancouver Canucks told them. And I'm guessing it won't be what the New York Rangers tell them. If I was picking, I like the goalie coach in Edmonton a lot, but I just don't know where he even stands in the new regime. If I was picking and I was Matt O'Connor, I'd be looking at the 2 organizations that have continuously, out of the 4, continuously produced goaltenders, developed goaltenders, built their teams based on how they play. And that's the New York Rangers with Benny Allaire and the Vancouver Canucks with Rolling Melanson. Their track record is excellent of late. As far as the other movement, I expect Dubnyk to stay in Minnesota. I know they've got some big contracts there and some issues, perhaps, in terms of salary cap. There's got to be a temptation if you're him to, sort of strike it rich now. This is the contract that
cash in.
This is his one shot, really. Yet everything he's been through over the last couple of years, and knowing him a little bit, and how he values off ice stuff and family and things that were really tough for him with all that moving around last year and not being able to see his newborn. And I think he's going to look, situation will be important for him. Mm-hmm. That means maybe even going shorter term in Minnesota for less money. And then when they have a little more space financially and you've done it for a few more years, taking the big ticket then. I mean, I don't see him leaving Minnesota for all the things I said about them being an ideal team to play behind. The Oilers were not. Like if Goalie not rush into Edmonton to play behind that team and a bunch of forwards who cheat on offense. Who knows where all the musical chairs end up? I don't know where Antti Niemi fits. I still think Antti Niemi could be a heck of a goaltender, especially if he goes to a team that gets him back to where he was in Chicago. And,
sure, yeah, I agree.
I mean, doesn't have him chasing extra depth and playing with all that. I scratch my head a little bit sometimes when I watched him in San Jose. They tried to make him a skater, and they got him off his knees a little bit in the early years, and I liked that. But then it went too far. Watch him in the playoffs against the Kings during that collapse. He'd be getting beat on clean looks off the rush because he'd be totally off his angle, because he'd be out 2 feet outside of the crease and trying to come back with the play. I mean, that's just not how Antti Niemi played when he had success. And it seems to me that he needs to find a good fit from a team structure and goalie coach perspective. And if he does, if you're looking for bargains next year, because I don't think he's getting a big ticket, Stanley Cup or not, he might be a good – he may end up being a steal in this summer's free agent market, like a Devin Dubnyk was for Arizona and ultimately now Minnesota.
Yeah. Just quickly before we go, Kevin, I know you cover the Vancouver Canucks for NHL.com. A little bit disappointed, I think, maybe to get knocked out by the Flames. I know a few people thought they had a good chance of progressing there. What's next for the Canucks with a slightly aging roster?
In terms of the team, I think it's more of the same. They're going to try and turn over parts of that aging roster for young players. They're kind of caught in that gap that teams get caught in. They're good enough to make the playoffs, not quite good enough to make noise in the playoffs, yet by making the playoffs, they don't get themselves into that draft lottery and a chance for real difference makers. So, they've got a difference maker in Bo Horvat, who, for all the talk of Sam Bennett for the Flames, to me was the best rookie in that series. And so they've got that, but he, of course, he came in the pick for Schneider. So, again, top 10 pick. They got a 6th overall in Jake Virtanen, and, it might be a stretch to ask him to make the NHL at 19 next season, but he's going to get every opportunity. And then they've got a handful of guys who were late first-round picks over the past 3-4 years that they need to push for jobs. They've also got Sven Barchi, who they got from the Flames, their former first-round pick. So, the prospects are not quite as high-end as some of these teams that have been out of the playoffs for 6 years, like a Calgary. And everyone says, go the Calgary model. Hey, missed the playoffs for 6 years? Awesome. Count the fan base in, I'm sure. I mean, they didn't even sell out in the first couple games of the playoffs here. I'm sure the fans would be all over 6 years without playoffs and not complain once, right? I think they're going to try and rebuild on the fly, and that means that having sort of that Detroit model of, hey, you're not going to have the high-end picks, but if you develop them over time in the American League, and they've got Travis Green, an excellent coach down there, they are going to be able to contribute. The question is, how many are going to be able to contribute and at what level next year, or do you need to show more patience? Berchi is here because he needs waivers, and they traded a second round pick to get him, and they don't want to lose him on waivers, so he's going to get a shot. The other part of that is, hey, listen, it's not like they could bring in 4 or 5 young guys anyways, is they got too many of the old guys on no trade contracts. So
Yeah.
they're probably going to have to move a couple guys on no trades just to create slight roster turnover. But we're still kind of more of the same probably for the next year, maybe two. One or two young guys hopefully do enough to make this team and force them to trade away one or two of the older guys and just slowly turn it over that way. Give themselves a chance to make the playoffs and see if they can do some damage once they're there. And that's about the best you can hope for. On a goaltending front, Miller's on for 2 more years. Everybody's speculating about Eddie Lack maybe being traded. I'm pretty sure the guy to go is Markstrom. I think they've seen the same things I've seen in terms of, what those two are in terms of upside. Markstrom, I believe, can be an NHL goaltender, but I don't think he has the same upside just in terms of his block-react dynamic as an Eddie Lack. And I believe they see that too. Lack being an unrestricted free agent next year presents problems with Miller under contract for 2 more years. But you heard it here first, and don't be surprised if we see a contract extension for Eddie Lack this summer. They believe in him, and I think they're going to try and keep him long-term and find a way to transition from Miller to him, starting with a better or more equitable share of the workload next year and transitioning forward from that. And that means that Markstrom, who would require waivers next year, probably gets moved. And frankly, given the state of the value of goaltending, not for a very high round pick. And that's the thing. Everybody thinks, we got all this goaltending, trade Eddie Lack and get us something in return. The reality is you're not getting much for him right now.
Nope. I agree with you there, despite I'm a Lack fan too, but there's so many people available via one means or another. It's not a real strong seller's market right now.
No, and he hasn't got enough of a track record that he's a year short. He's a good year short of where Corey Schneider was when they got the 9th overall pick for Corey Schneider. So I believe he can get there. I believe he's got the skill set. And I mean, Rob, you love this kid. Like, he was on the ice yesterday for 2 hours trying to figure some things out so that he's got a solid base to work on in the summer. That's 4 days after being eliminated. He's on the ice for 2 hours working out some kinks in his game. He's got plans to bring in a guy next week that I know for some video work and to work on this head trajectory stuff. Kid's a workhorse. He wants to be better. He's a good pro, and he's got a personality that can survive the tough market that is Vancouver and the challenges that are being an NHL goaltender. He's just got a great mindset and approach to the whole thing, and yet he's not all happy-go-lucky off. He works his ass off the ice, and he wants to be the best. So I think there's still a lot of upside yet to be seen from Eddie Lack here in Vancouver.
Awesome. Well, unfortunately, we've run out of time, Kev. Thank you very much for joining me today. Where can people find you on Twitter?
Kevin is InGoal, and of course, they can find both of us at InGoal Magazine as well, writing regularly, and at NHL.com for me too.
Yeah, perfect. Well, as I said, thank you very much for joining me. It's always a pleasure to have you on to get our heads together about the goaltending side of things, and especially with the playoffs at such a key stage. It's going to be pretty important, I think it's fair to say.
Absolutely. It's the best time of year, and it was a blast talking about it with you, Rob.
As always, you can follow me at RobMcGregor35. As Kevin mentioned, you can find us both at ingoalmag.com and also the blog onepuckshort.wordpress.com. We're on Facebook, facebook.com/onepuckshort, and now Tumblr as well, onepuckshort.tumblr.com. Dead easy. If you want to get in touch with the show, it's just onepuckshort@gmail.com. Couldn't be simpler, right? Thanks again to my guest today, Kevin Woodley. Thanks to everybody at home for listening. I'll speak to you again very soon.